Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is Professor Yamamoto. It is March 23rd, year 2025, and it's 4 o'clock p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Welcome, everybody. I see any number of familiar names here in the chat room. Please let me know if there are any problems on your end so far as monitoring is concerned. We're okay. All right. Just need to double check as my monitoring ability is limited here. So let's launch right into it. I intentionally put in a little bit of a cryptic title here for you, but if you want to unpack the description, it encapsulates the main points that I want to make here. So far as the method of historical investigation, in this case, we're talking about the so-called JFK papers, the release. That's going to be the focus of today's talk. With the big difference, I'm going, and this is embodied in the title. I call it the Yellowcaust, Yellow cost, because I'm focusing on the Asian, quote unquote Asian, or the yellow dimension. It's more than a dimension, the yellow connection or the yellow world that's involved intrinsically in the recent releases, the ongoing releases. And there have been many in the past, by the way. And so far, I haven't read anything new. And that doesn't bother me and it didn't surprise me. What it does do is bring for myself a sense of completion for my own personal and professional quest to understand my life and times and to teach it to the new generations of Americans and people of all nationalities around the world so that we can understand the infrastructure of this great white whale called the United States of America, the behemoth. This is what was being written about easily by the time the mid-19th century was unfolding. This is Herman Melville. He could see this unfolding. But it's not a metaphor. It's a very real empire. And the reason why I'm taking this approach today is because for many non-specialists, or even many historians, many professional researchers, journalists, intellectuals, academic types, the Asian connection is not fully understood. It's not appreciated. It's not even recognized in many cases. And that's one of the reasons why I, in particular, chose this area for my own professional identity, because this is a huge area that was not being covered adequately. Now, does that mean it was neglected? No, not at all. In fact, today I want to, as part of this larger agenda, enormous agenda that I've set for myself today, I want to recognize singular individuals who have contributed to this storehouse of knowledge that is going unacknowledged. And instead, okay, indulge me for a moment. I'll try to keep it short. I won't go on my typical rant about the newbies and the pop-up pundits and all those other people, but those are the people who are taking the credit for what's been a marathon. I use the analogy of these characters who they enter the marathon, right? A race. And somewhere where the crowd's kind of thin and there's no supervision, they'll jump on the municipal bus, or someone will pick them up in the car and they'll give them a ride for about 10, 15 miles, and then they'll let them off shortly before the conclusion of the race. And then they go to the finish line and miraculously they win the Boston Marathon. Say, oh, we won, I won, I won. Okay, those are your Candace Owens and your Ian Carroll and your Ben Shapiro. The Daily Wire, by the way, I hear it's going down the tubes because due to people like you who can see through the BS now, you can tell who real and who are the real fake people are because they don't have a monopoly on it like they used to. They meaning the indies as well as the networks. Anyway, let's leave that aside because you've heard my rants over and over again. And if you've also heard my rants about yellow this, yellow that, and why you focus so much on race, well, you're gonna learn why. I made it my business, my professional business, to explore these dark sides of American history with the same level of intensity, ambition that great Americans like Herman Melville brought to the task. What is the nature of the great white whale? And then later on, shortly thereafter, you have people like Mark Twain, who was a master anti-American imperialist as it was beginning to unfold in the late 19th century. And remember, Melville had already anticipated this. Fenimore Cooper as well, tying it to the frontier history. And where does the frontier end? And is it going to be taken overseas to the Philippines, to the Korean Peninsula, to China, in the assistance of the great French Empire, in Indochine, as they call it, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, or the British Empire, Singapore, Malaysia? Are we going to follow that trajectory? These issues were being hotly debated and contested at the turn of the 20th century, the 19th and 20th century, by such great Americans as Samuel Clemens. And I know you weren't, and sing with me, we weren't taught Mark Twain in that vein. We stuck with Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and all, great. Life on the Mississippi, love it. And all the movies with cute little Becky Thatcher, right? And the runaway slave, Jim, all, I get it. But there's the other part of Mark Twain that to this day, we as Americans are loath to encounter, to really look at, because it's not a pretty picture. It's a self-portrait. Why do you think the great artists always have a self-portrait series? They're checking themselves out. They're assessing their craft, their eye, their perceptions, and turning it towards themselves. Self-portrait. So this is what all of us need to be doing. Call it introspection, self-examination. And we could use this opportunity now, amidst all the celebration, to reflect deeply on ourselves individually and on our mission as a nation. And we do have a mission. It's not the mission of imperialism, as you've probably already picked up. In fact, it's that course, that trajectory that has pushed us to the brink of annihilation. And I'm trying to say we don't need to go down that course. All right. So for this purpose, and again, I want to thank all my regular viewers and new visitors as well, who are coming to the channel by large numbers. I guess they're bailing out of Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire and all these other controlled assets and coming to channels that they're more demanding, I'd say. They're more rigorous and they require more of the viewer. But people want that. Most people do. I mean, you have your people who want to just play video games and watch the Marvel or the DC universe. It's your universe. It's not our universe. It's the Disney universe. There are those people, but even those people are getting sick of it. They don't want to see Snow Brown premiere. They're disinterested because somewhere along the line it was rewritten from Snow White to Snow Brown. Oh my gosh. So I was inspired in part by the fact that in reading all this literature, these are all books on my current shelf here. And I have boxes and boxes more of Kennedy, MLK, RFK, you name it, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. I have a whole, I don't know, I have never counted, but I have scores, maybe hundreds of books on political assassination. And I still do not call myself an expert on it. And by the way, let's clarify this at the outset. So we're talking about the so-called release of the JFK papers. There's a fundamental misunderstanding of what these papers represent. They are not some magic key that are going to reveal historical truths, these immutable realities that are all of a sudden going to unlock the mysteries of our recent past. That's not the function of history, right? But that's a commonplace understanding. So that's why some people are disappointed. On the other spectrum, there are people who are cynical, say, well, I wasn't expecting anything anyway. Well, you're also wrong. You're both wrong. History, I guess, if I could, and I've studied historiography, I went to grad school, all that stuff. And you do, if you're in the social sciences, history, or maybe even in the humanities, from day one in grad school, the question the professor asks you in the opening seminar, how do you know what you know? How do you know anything about Herman Melville? How can you make any definitive statement of what that book means or what he represents? And they tear you down. It's a boot camp. It's the equivalent of shaving the head of a recruit who just comes in for induction in the military, and they strip you down. Unfortunately, they typically try to rebuild you as a Marxist or a feminist or a race person or whatever their particular professor's bag is. They try to recreate you in their image. Inadvertently, sometimes it's very overt. They want disciples. And I can talk to you for hours about how I have to resist that. I was never tempted. I'm my own person. So are you. You don't have to listen to me. Just consider what I'm saying either. I don't want a disciple. I don't have any disciples. I hope I don't. All right. This is not a catechism. This is not a church. That's not what history is, the doing of history. Right. And that's not what the JFK, I'll use quotation marks when I say that, so I don't have to keep going like this. Just say, I'm bracketing it. That's not what the JFK papers represent. They represent a decades-long tribute, an homage to the hundreds, maybe thousands by now, of amateur researchers, explorers, eyewitnesses, testifiers, as well as professional historians, scholars, journalists, ranging from people like Alfred McCoy. I could reel off names galore and forget most of them in doing so. So I'm going to avoid the temptation. But I'll even throw names like Roger Stone in there. He's written a number of books on the assassinations. He's done one on the LBJ participation in it. So the list goes on and on and on. And that's the mental block I encountered when I was prepping for this talk. How do I break down this huge body of knowledge, research, blood, sweat, and tears of ordinary as well as incredibly gifted thinkers and writers and communicators? How do I boil that down and present it in 60 minutes? So I said, well, I'm not going to try. Instead, I'll just fall back on my own experience. All right. And I know a lot of you have heard my stories. I try not to repeat myself, but I have a personal anecdote about everything that I cover in over 4 years now of talks on TubeU that have been suppressed, and I understand some people are being unsubscribed from my channel. So keep at it, keep subscribing, keep adding, getting your friends, family, and your children and grandchildren to subscribe, not because of my ego gratification, but because I want to get over on YouTube as an act of defiance against these pop-up pundits and these trust fund Nepo babies whose daddies and mommies bought them YouTube channels and bought them millions of subscribers because they're basically actors. There are no acting gigs anymore, or they're retooled comedians. You've heard my rap on that, right? So join up here and while you're watching me, subscribe because TubeU or somebody, some gremlin, the ghost in the machine is unsubscribing people from what I'm hearing. All right. And also join my Patreon because you'll get some really good material that I can't, not because of security or worry about my fear or my safety. I just can't present it in the YouTube format. The material, supplementary videos, PDFs, and other worthwhile material that could be useful to you. Ranging from curiosity or some of you writing your own books, which is great. I want to encourage that. So join my Patreon, if you would. Okay. So with all the housekeeping out of the way, and to explain why I'm taking this particular approach, let me begin, and you're going to have to watch it closely. All right. If you're washing the dishes right now, I'll give you a few seconds to get to the computer monitor and watch this here on my show, right? Not just a radio only show, an audio only show. I present a lot of visual material here, so you're going to have to watch closely. It's none other than Lyndon Baines Johnson himself talking about it. It could be just bragging, right? I mean, that's not that was part of his persona, his makeup, his personality, braggadocio. That's LBJ Deluxe. So, yep, we had to send in some of our thugs out there and get rid of Yim. And he's talking about no Yim and his brother. They got whacked. They were assassinated. This was before the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1963. And I was going to put a photo for the pic here for TubeU of President Yim dead, sitting there with bleeding out, shot, black and white photo. But I said, no, I think TubeU might give the opposition a little bit too much of a heads up. So I put the more familiar photo up there for your use, but I'll send along that photo to the people on Patreon. Those are the types of material that you will get. But for now, let's lead up with LBJ. And I do believe he had a hand. He wasn't the only one. It was kind of like, the opening of Macbeth. There's more than one witch stirring the cauldron, casting spells and doing hexes. Right? It doesn't have to be one person or one group, but I think he was involved. And I say this because there's some historians or commentators who said he had nothing to do with it. For whatever reason, we don't have the time to really identify these people and try to address the different pros and cons of was LBJ involved or not. And those are they're important issues, but they're peripheral to the larger issue of why yellow people are not front and center when talking about the JFK papers. Because as we all know, if you've read the basic texts, JFK Revisited, it's an edited anthology by James D. Eugenio, or Who Really Killed Martin Luther King Jr. This is Philip F. Nelson. These are just a couple books I pulled off my shelf. Or, and this is where the yellow comes in, JFK versus Alan Dulles, subtitled Battleground Indonesia by Greg Polgrain. And there's another one called The Jakarta Method. I'll show you some videos here that cite these works here, because that was really the testing grounds. That was the lead up to what we call the Vietnam War. And by the way, the Vietnam War does not go by that title in Vietnam. I've been there. Okay. Unlike a lot of these desk jockeys who talk so knowingly about China and the Chi-coms, right? And how China is going to take over the world, or the Chinese, because there's usually some Australian or New Zealander or a Brit talking about the Chinese who are going to take over the world. Well, most of those people have not been any closer to Asia than Panda restaurants. And that goes to the people in Pacific Palisades. The closest they've ever been to Asia is Mr. Chow restaurant. All right, but I have been to Vietnam, and I've gone to the War Museum. I happened to land, and I have to confess, I didn't know what day it was, but I landed in Vietnam and was in Hanoi on the very day of Ho Chi Minh's birthday, and the whole city was shut down. It was all just one giant carnival, a festival. There was no automobile, they usually drive motor scooters, if you don't know. Motor scooters are a very much Asian thing, even in Japan, Taiwan. We yellow people love our motor scooter, and I'd like to see motor scooters in America, right, instead of Teslas. I'm not going to be burning Teslas, but, I want to see some motor scooters. I think in the college towns, they'd be okay, and, if we're going to be allowed that, right? But if you read your basic history, you know that JFK said, hey, listen, we're going to allow the so-called third world. That's not a term that I use. That's a term that Cold Warriors use, the academic types who are in the Beltway, the think tanks, the people who are receiving over the years now millions and millions of dollars from USAID. The so-called think they need to be shut down, because you and me are the think tank. And I'm certainly not getting no money from USAID. I'm getting money from you. Thank you very much. I do appreciate it, because these books cost money. Right. So I've been to Vietnam, and I understand how they, not completely, because I'm not Vietnamese. I didn't go through the war over there. I went through the war in Vietnam here in the U.S. as a draftee who was drafted but didn't go. The war ended before they took my sorry self over there. I was number 10 on the lottery. There was a draft lottery that was imposed, for those of you who don't know, because before they were just drafting black men and Mexicans and underclass white people from the Appalachians. They knew the zip code where they lived, and they drafted their butts and sent them to Vietnam to kill the yellow man in the land of Vietnam. And there are certain black leaders who said, why are you using our black people as sacrifices for a country that doesn't accept us as full-blown citizens? Everybody from Malcolm X to Martin Luther King raised that issue. And as soon as Martin Luther King said, The bombs that we drop on Vietnam will explode here in the United States. He was dead a short time later because he connected what was going on internationally with the domestic situation. And I've read all those books, the biographies on Martin Luther King, both the orthodox, the spin ones, as well as the critical ones, and the ones that seemingly are critical but are really British intelligence. People like Anthony Summers falls in that category. Very, very good. But he's the hand of British intelligence has, to me, from his recent work, has revealed itself. And that's how I see a lot of these people who are from Canada, nothing against Canadians, or from Australia, from Britain, who are so concerned about what's going on in America. Right? It's kind of a controlling love. Like you're still going to be part of the Commonwealth. You're going to be part of the empire, but we're going to warn you about all the bad people in your country. But we're not going to talk about Keir Starmer. We're not going to talk about Dr. Kidman down in Australia, or all the bad people down in New Zealand, all the pedophiles down. But we'll come to America and we'll tell you about how bad your society is. That's an intelligence operation, ladies and gentlemen. And just because they're quote unquote white does not make them right. Right? Okay. Don't be fooled. And if you don't think that's an issue, Donald Trump says, yeah, I'm going to entertain the possibility that the United States becomes either a full-fledged or honorary member of the British Commonwealth. The British King of England is going to come over to have Donald Trump kiss the ring, and J.D. Vance. He's going to give him the classic Churchillian spiel. That's Yiddish or German, if you will. He's going to give him the spiel, the sales pitch. We are two countries separated by a common language, right? Says, oh yeah, Trump, you have Anglo-Saxon roots, through your mother. Isn't she Scottish extraction? J.D. Vance, yeah, this is not a great, your people are from the British Isles. It's the whole blood and soil argument. So they might go for it. So I'm just raising that recent development, to show you that these are not innocuous gestures in this ongoing battle that's not going to be finished with the release of the so-called JFK papers. It never will be. I subscribe to the Umberto Eco. He was an academic, but he was also a writer, novelist. You know about him. In the Name of the Rose, Foucault's Pendulum, great essayist, all that. Professore Umberto Eco, he talks about a concept of the opera aperta. That means like an opera, a magisterial song and flashbangs and pageantry and music and arrangement and acting and plot and narrative that doesn't end. It's a grand opera. It doesn't have, the fat lady doesn't come out and sing at the end. That's how I interpret it. Maybe I'm getting it wrong, but I like the image. The fat lady does not come out and sing. There was a fat lady in my department who came out and sang and tried to sit on me. And by the way, she was a yellow person. In fact, all the people in my department were yellow people, and they were the most aggressive in trying to shut me up. So it's not a racial or ethnic or a color issue that I'm talking about here. So anyway, before I wander too far afield, let me show you this clip of Lyndon Johnson. This is his own voice from what I can tell. And if I was a decent researcher, I would have this source authenticated, because we all know about AI and deep fakes and Chat GPT and deep seek, don't we not? Yeah. The First Lady, Melania Trump, made a public appearance saying that she's going to lead the way to control this threat to speech acts, AI, deep fakes, revenge porn, because that gets people's attention. If you talk about deep fakes, people, okay. So, but a revenge for, okay, yeah, let me check that out. Porn, right? OnlyFriends or Pornhub is the big one, right? Anyway, that's another discussion. Maybe I'll do that at some other point. But here's Lyndon Johnson himself, ostensibly, again, who says, yeah, we sent some people over to Vietnam and we sent some thugs and we had a yim, dude. We had them blasted away. Shortly thereafter, Kennedy was whacked too. And those of you who are familiar with the literature know that Kennedy was set up. He wasn't told this was going to happen. I'm talking about John F. Kennedy, because there's been more than one Kennedy that's been assassinated. You know about RFK Sr. and the little known assassination plot against JFK Jr. Now, you want to talk about documents being released? Those are the documents I want to see. I want to see the books written on JFK Jr.'s assassination. But like, again, as Umberto Eco, Professor Eco said, this is opera aperta or operta. It doesn't end. The fat lady on the historical stage has not come out to sing and never will. That's not the nature of historical inquiry. The same with science. Also, it's the same delusion that people have. Oh, science. Oh, with its definitive results. 9 out of 10 doctors say that blah, blah, blah. And trust me, I'm the science. I am science. You don't need to look no further. I got the definitive results. It's the same type of hyper-rationalistic thinking, pseudo-scientific thinking, scientism that people bring to an examination of history. Now, don't let that depress you. I think that's an opportunity. I think it's a blessing. Not because it just creates more work for me. What it does is say that, hey, there's much more research that needs to be done, and we need to uncover more. And we can start reforming the curriculum in the K through 12 area by refocusing it instead of on mutilating your genitals and to promoting gender dysphoria, that's their little medicalized term, or to promote queerism in the university curriculum. We can start exploring ancient civilizations. When there's a discovery that in the Giza Plateau, there's all these underground structures that only recently have been detected by current technology, by a yellow man, by the way, Japanese by nationality. And forgive me for tooting my horn, like on the ethnic, racial, yellow stuff, okay? But you know why I'm doing that, right? We as Orientals are not we're not enculturated to brag about ourselves, to toot our own horns. We just go about our genius quietly, and we think our contributions will be appreciated in a sort of a subtle way. But we don't do the thing is, yeah, I'm the winner of the annual Image Awards, the NAACP, Negro of the Year award, or I'm Mr. Super Jew who has done the most for civil rights, or whatever group. That's not our style, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why we are being pushed. I'm talking about the yellow people aside, including our historiography, the centrality that the yellow people played in the so-called Vietnam War, which the Vietnamese people, to finish up my story, which the Vietnamese people call the war against American imperial aggression. That's how it's translated. It's in Vietnamese, but that's how they see the war. In Japan, which I've also spent a lot of time in, I would like to spend more time, right? But I have a job to do here, and I have a career in the US. But I've done a lot of investigation in these areas that I'm talking about. That's all I'm trying to say. In Japan, World War II is called Taiheiyo Senso, That's the Greater East Asia War. That's how they understand the war. So the titles that the respective countries give to their own conflicts tells you a lot about how they conceive of their own national mission and how they understand their role within the society, right? And also that of their opponents, right? That's part of historiography as well. We have to control for that. So and I'm going to also tell you, like Peter Dale Scott, his name is mentioned all the time, the deep state, this and that. I don't really use that term, right? Because it's a redundancy. If you're talking about the state or politics, that includes deep, that includes covert, that includes secrecy. That's the very nature of the state, okay? But even he, the great Peter Dale Scott, and he, by the way, he's Canadian. He's not a U.S. citizen. You would think after decades of living in America, he'd go the final step and become an American citizen like the rest of us. I'm a third generation on the mother side of the family, fourth generation American citizen. All right, but I'm still Mr. Miyagi to a lot of people in the United States of America, at least. Maybe, in the English-speaking world. I don't know. But I did happen to meet him. I met a lot of these people who've written these books. I was at a conference, and I think who else was there? It was Peter Dale Scott. Jim Mars was there. And this is down in Santa Cruz, California, right? There's a UC Santa Cruz, but this wasn't on the campus because the university doesn't like conspiracy theories unless it's to try to mock it or subvert it. And I know that because I had people on my campus. One of them, her name was Catherine Olmsted. She's in the history department, who was put on me there to squelch me. She was put on me by the yellow people in my department. They said, well, you're in conspiracy theory. Professor Holmes said, we have a problem child here. His name's Hamamoto. Why don't you make sure that he doesn't get his promotion or his raise and make sure that he doesn't get any further than his current rank? And by the way, I did retire at the rank of Professor 4, full professor at the University of California. All right. So I'm not a crackpot. And I did that through legitimate means. I didn't do it like Catherine Olmsted did it. Right. She got her undergraduate degree at UC Davis in history. She got her master's degree at UC Davis. Then she married a professor of history at UC Davis. Then she got her PhD at UC Davis. And then she became the chairman of the history department at UC Davis. Right. I'll let you infer how she got into the academic world, but I'll tell you, I didn't have to suck any cock to get where I got. All right. We'll just leave it at that. And that goes on. Remember, academia is Hollywood for ugly people. So I'm telling you the stories out of class here. You're getting the smut. If you're on my Patreon, you'll get the real low down bird's eye. That's just a sampling. Because I vowed years ago that there would be some payback here. That's what's going down right here. I hope this video goes to her funky bad self. I think she's still over there. Look her up. I have some video up on it in another future talk. I'll talk about some of these characters in academia who have persecuted people such as myself, who are so-called conspiracy theorists. Why? Is it because I feel sorry for myself? Not at all. Because as you can tell, you can bet your bottom dollar, I got my licks in. I will go down to the low post and use my elbows when necessary. Okay, I'm a very competitive person. You have to be if you're in my world. That's just the nature of the game. That's what allows me to understand the mindset of someone like LBJ. He's a natural bone killer. That's the title of an Oliver Stone movie. He's one of the few artists and intellectuals in American contemporary society who understands the great white whale. That's the great filmmaker, writer Oliver Stone. So there's hope. The release of the FBI files are a tribute to people like Oliver Stone and the researchers who helped him, people like a Jim DiEugenio and others. Too many to name. I'm sorry if I'm slighting people by not putting their name out there, right? Because there's tons of them. That would be better in an essay to just list them and give tip the hat. But I'm just telling you now, we owe the world of truth, historical truth, to people like Oliver Stone. And you know about JFK, the movie. And the reason his name is foremost on my mind now, he also wrote the intro to this, the forewords, the afterwards. He's still doing it. And I was in Japan once and I saw him on Japanese television, Oliver Stone, and he was touring Okinawa, the US military bases that run that part of Japan and Japan in general. Japan is a client state of America. It's a giant aircraft carrier military base for America. But the people who are in JFK conspiracy only talk about Atsugi Air Force Base because Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly was stationed there. Well, that's just one minor blip. And I lived in Okinawa for a year. I appreciated the fact that Oliver Stone went there to see how the U.S. military, even now, is running the show, a bunch of over yellow people. And he also went to Korea. And the U.S. military uses some of their offshore islands as targets for their ordnance. This is going now. But do we hear anything about military base closures? No. And military officers themselves told me personally, they said the people who are in the Air Force, especially, they seem to get the best perks of the man. He says, man, I've been all over the world and the best golf courses are always around by the USAF. He was having, this was up in a big meeting up in the Sequoia Country Club. This is in the Berkeley or the Oakland Hills, way up there. Over the hills, you can see the San Francisco Bay. They invited me up there because they wanted to cultivate me. They wanted to see if they could use me as a yellow person, as a Japanese ancestry person, and Okinawan too, to deploy me in a way that'll make their historiographic truths pop out. And I said, no, I'm not interested in this. All right. Well, forgive me for the anecdotes, but I'm just telling you this because I'm not a desk jockey. I've experienced this process from the inside out. All right, so here's LBJ. I understand his psychopathy because I might have some of it myself. You know, I understand his psychology. Comes from humble roots. People disregard. They just thought he was some ignorant, stupid Southerner, some cracker. You know, some po' boy. And he wanted to show the establishment that he was somebody. Now, for me, that's not one of my ambitions, but that's LBJ. So, if it requires getting rid of a president of another country, which is the CIA's job, by the way, you understand that? It's not in the job description. It's not in any documents, JFK files or anything. It's not written down anywhere, but that's their part of their job. Assassination. All right. Most of you understand that theoretically, but you haven't internalized it because you're still looking, not you who are watching this, but many Americans are still looking at the papers as being some form of sport, spectator sport. They're so used to video games and MLB and NFL and NBA, that everything to you is a sporting contest. So here's LBJ.
Me on Jim, you remember. Yeah. He was corrupt and he ought to be killed. So we killed him. We all got together and got a goddamn bunch of thugs and we went in and assassinated him. Now, we really had no political stability since then.
Okay, we got to see that again. It went so quick. This is LBJ.
They started with me on Jim, you remember. Yeah. He was corrupt and he ought to be killed. So we killed him. We all got together and got a goddamn bunch of thugs and we went in and assassinated him. Now, we really had no political stability since then.
There you go. And don't take that clip for what it's worth. Look at the historical research. It's clear that LBJ's hands were bloody and that he did have this agenda. And conversely, John F. Kennedy's agenda was the polar opposite. At least in this particular book, this interpretation by Philip Nelson, JFK was sympathetic to the so-called third world. He wanted the African nations after colonialism to thrive. He didn't say he was going to build them up with economic aid, but he certainly didn't want to oppress them, as happened after he was assassinated. And that model still exists. Instead, guess who's taking the lead in building Africa? It's China. China has gone into to build infrastructure all through Africa. And again, I was tipped off by this when I was in Beijing once, and I saw a bunch of black people in the central Beijing train station. And I said, "Who are all these black people?" And I said, "They're Africans." And then I started thinking, what are they doing here? And I realized, oh, they're cultivating them. They're going to invest big time in China. This is what was going on already. They're training the doctors, the educators. They're doing the language exchange. They're training engineers. What was the United States doing? What was Belgium doing? What was France doing? They were trying to do their as much as they could to extract every last living resource they could out of Chinchaloba uranium mine, whatever it was. And writers, I keep returning to writers like Joseph Conrad were documenting that, while at the high point of Belgian imperialism and French, the great Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, he was a steamship captain who saw the Africans who had their limbs cut off because they were caught stealing or they were insubordinate, whatever it was. He saw that. We don't have writers like that. We have people who are getting funding from USID and they put them on YouTube. They're so-called indie reporters and researchers and writers. They're actors. Okay. Now, that's an overstatement. There are some people who are still doing good journalism and good research. I don't want to paint them all the same brush, but you get the point I'm making. That's why we keep going back to these authors. That's why, at least that's why I do it. So Indonesia is really the start point of Vietnam and the wars in Latin America, and also the counterinsurgencies wars in the African continent, and also the Middle East. That's why it's called the Jakarta system, the Jakarta method, Jakarta, Indonesia. This was workshopped, and as his title reflects, Alan Dulles, this is his name that's familiar to all the well-read people here in the chat room. You know who he is. You know the backstory. I don't need to go into it. And who won that battle? Alan Dulles did, because he had the thugs behind him. JFK did not have any soldiers, I don't think. I wonder if Donald Trump has any soldiers, because it looks like all the bullets are flying in one direction only. Anyway, that's a separate conversation that I'm not going to have publicly. I have a suspicion he does have a a security detail, let's call it, that we don't hear about. All right, so here again is LBJ at point zero, Indonesia. Most of you don't hear about. You certainly didn't hear about by all the names, including Peter Dale Scott, about the Jakarta connection.
American nation cannot, must not, and will not permit the establishment of another communist government.
In 1965 and 1966, the Indonesian military intentionally killed approximately 1 million innocent civilians with the active, enthusiastic participation of the United States government. My name is Vincent Bevins, and I wrote The Jakarta Method, Washington's anti-communist crusade, and the mass murder program that shaped our world.
Journalist Vincent Bevins explains how a U.S.-sponsored disinformation campaign was used around the world with deadly results.
The Jakarta Method is the intentional mass murder of leftists or people accused of being leftists. And this was employed throughout the world in the Cold War. And the most important part of this story, not the first event in the tale, is the US-backed mass murder of approximately 1 million innocent civilians in Indonesia in 1965. This massacre was one of the most important turning points of the Cold War, one of the biggest successes for the West and its allies. And it was such a big success that it inspired movements elsewhere around the world, specifically in Latin America, to copy the tactics employed there. And they used the word Jakarta to denote what they were going to do to their own leftists or accused leftists, which was to kill them.
What happened in Indonesia began on October 1st, 1965, with a military coup.
Some members of the Indonesian military that believe or say that they believe that their superior officers are organizing a right-wing coup kidnap some of them, and 6 generals end up dead. This is all very mysterious. But what we know very well is that immediately afterwards, a general named Suharto takes control of the country, ignoring...
Okay, we're getting into the deep history there, which is important. And I again refer you to the book so you can get the granular details on this. This is part of what I believe the JFK files should be looking at, or we should be looking at the files to talk about how these decisions were being made. What was the real connection between the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the advisors around Johnson, in committing this mass genocide in Indonesia, later to be applied in Vietnam, where a total of close to 3 million combined soldiers and civilians on both sides lost their lives. Laotians, Cambodians, Vietnamese, and Americans. Right, with American troops, maybe up to 60,000 soldiers. Right, most of the casualties were yellow civilians. Right, I'm not even talking about NVA, the soldiers. I'm talking about the people who were killed through mass bombing campaigns in Vietnam. To me, that's the area of the FBI or the JFK files that needs to be emphasized. And that's why I'm here spending this time with you, so that we can widen the focus, right? It's not going to be the exclusive focus, but it's certainly going to be beyond the little rah-rah type of circus that's been built up around the release. And I think it was done intentionally by the security, or these quote unquote intelligence establishment itself, to lead us up to that point and disappoint us. But again, I wasn't disappointed because I know already from reading hundreds of these books myself, and you have too. We've already put it together. The story there are huge gaps, but for the most part, the lesson has been told through films, through books, through reportage, through testimonial, through transcripts. We don't need the JFK files to tell us what we already know. Do you understand that? I mean, a couple of years after a search was mounted, researchers went to where was it, National Archives? They were, that President Kennedy, when he was being autopsied, they took his brain and they put it in a stainless steel container and they took it away for safekeeping and had it filed away at the National Archives. So some researcher went over to look for it and it was missing. It's still missing. People do not know where JFK's brain is. But does that change the story, our understanding of the assassination? I mean, that's one feature of the presidency that Joe Biden and JFK share. They hold in common the fact that both of them have brains that are missing. Does that change our perception in any fundamental way? No, it doesn't. It's an interesting story, but it does not really take us into any further knowledge. But, there's people also, by the way, who lead these little side trips, of devoted followers to look at the nooks and crannies of the supposed quote unquote deep state. And it doesn't go anywhere. It's not intended to lead anywhere. It's known as a fool's errand. Do you understand? Give them something to do so that they'll never really find out anything. And they also won't have any spare time to really ponder what's going on in this world of ours. Okay, let's move on to the next clip here. This is the Laos situation. Right? We're talking about Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam.
Border lies the small, rugged state of Laos. Following its independence in 1954 after the Geneva Convention and France's defeat by the Viet Minh in the First Indochina War, international attention largely turned away from the small landlocked state and towards its much more populous and contentious neighbors, the states of North and South Vietnam. Laos emerged from the post-Geneva period in relative stability compared to its neighbor South Vietnam, which was immediately put on the defensive, firstly from North Vietnamese Army stay-behind forces, which according to the Pentagon papers included approximately 5,000 to 10,000 men. These stay-behind units, which had not retreated with the rest of the Viet Minh after the ink had dried at Geneva, worked to recruit local peasants to the cause of socialist revolution, growing the insurgency and putting further strain on the South Vietnamese government. These stay-behind forces would officially become the Viet Cong in 1960, a rugged guerrilla organization receiving their marching orders directly from the government in Hanoi, and being constantly reinforced through the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Okay, there's tons of books on the Vietnam War. I'll just bring in a personal anecdote. Years later, and I was high school, the Vietnam War went on forever. It was most of my childhood. And it was even through my college years. I think the war ended when I was about ready to graduate in 1975. 73, 75, it started to de-escalate. So I lived through this. Then years later, after I went to grad school and really understood what I wanted to do with my life, which is to teach and research and read, and one day have my own YouTube channel to be with you and become a YouTube celebrity, not really. You can leave the last part out. But what happened, I wanted to be UC Davis, and I taught the children of who were the children of refugees from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, who were at the University of California, because they had grown up as refugee children and now going to college and university. And that was those were the people in my class. They didn't understand their own family history. It was rooted in this conflict. And they had a completely different understanding of what America is about. So you can imagine why the administration didn't appreciate it when Professor Yamamoto was saying was revealing the history about, for example, the drug wars, another excellent book, that their dads might have been involved with as military officers in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or working for Pol Pot, for all I know. I mean, I didn't treat him in that vein. That's not how I approached them. But I had to realize that a lot of them, their parents were right wingers. They were part of these mercenary armies that were fighting for the CIA and for the Sûreté and for the Secret Services, SAS. And now they were in America, and then they were my students. But I had to tell them the truth. And a lot of them wound up ratting me out. They were turned against me because their dads were probably rats. Right? Okay, there's Nguyen over there. Okay, let's rat him out so that we can take his house. Or there's Ho over there. Let's rat him out so we can get his business. Right? It's kind of, a very common strategy that criminals play amongst themselves. So there was that going on. By the way, there was also people like that in my own particular ethnic community. When I went to the meeting up in Sequoia Country Club, it was for Japanese American war veterans, World War II veterans. And you would think that having been in concentration camps themselves in the United States, them and their families and their parents, their siblings, that they would have some understanding of what American empire can do. That was wrong. They had no problems joining the Air Force and going to Vietnam and dropping bombs on fellow yellows, and including Agent Orange. And so that's when I realized, man, I just don't really have a full understanding of human complexities. I was looking at the world a little bit too rigidly, I guess. And I really didn't fully understand what human beings are capable of, even those who are supposedly on the good guys' side. But I know better now, and this is what I'm sharing with you. So this is when I started calling myself a yellow person instead of Asian American, because I realized that term had been co-opted by a bunch of right-wing, self-righteous, wannabe leftist, Marxist, deconstructionist, DEI, critical race theory, pretenders, fakes. So that should answer your question why I call myself yellow instead of Asian. That's a U.S. census taker term, which I don't accept. All right. Okay. Say you're not yellow, which is a good chance that you're not, who are watching here. Right. This is not all about yellow people. There's something that's called blowback. Right. This is when you send a chemical weapon over to the enemy people, and there's a gust of wind or the currents change and it starts to waft back over on your side. That's called blowback. Right. This is why poison gas is used sparingly in most combat situations to avoid blowback. There's other meanings of it too, but in the combat mode, it's blowback. Well, a lot of people who are not yellow got blowback from dioxin. It's a Dow chemical compound, DOW, better known as Agent Orange. And it was the chemical weapon used in the mass deforestation of Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And it had cross-generational effect on the populations and genetic mutations. And you can see this on display. I don't know about America, but in Vietnam, they have the fetuses with two heads or malformed. They don't even look human. They look reptilian. Or you see some that made it to term and were born and are crippled in the most hideous fashion in Vietnam now, right? Because of Agent Orange. But okay, that's still yellow people we're talking about. But there's also people who were in the military who got dosed with it, blowback, who were on the ground, or they were in the Air Force loading this material, or they were in the pattern. Somehow they it's really toxic, right? And I don't know if they've been fully compensated for their pain and suffering that was inflicted upon them by their own government. So no one's free in this. No one gets a pass on these types of activities. Let's call them. I'm trying to be as neutral as possible, right? And if this can be done on a routine basis, on a rational, bureaucratic, scientific fashion, abstractly, then sure as hell, someone like LBJ has no problem getting rid of singular individuals, right? He had no problem, or to him and others. I'm just using him as a sign symbol for a whole array of people, including Robert S. McNamara, Melvin Laird, all these characters. No problem. Wipe them out. So here we go. There's a little bit of a example of the dioxin campaign.
Because I happen to believe that Henry Kissinger was one of the most destructive secretaries of state in the modern history of this country. I am proud to say that Henry Kissinger is not my friend. I will not take advice from Henry Kissinger. And in fact, Kissinger's actions in Cambodia, when the United States bombed that country, overthrew Prince Sihanouk, created the instability for Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge to come in, who then butchered some 3 million innocent people, one of the worst genocides in the history of the world.
While things are stable in Cambodia, next door in Vietnam, trouble is brewing, and
I purposely put that Bernie Sanders clip in there to trigger you, because I want to have you exercise your rational faculties and saying, hey, what he's saying is right. I know it's Bernie Sanders and he's a multimillionaire and he's teaming up with Alexandrix Ocasio-Cortez, right? Because she's a Latinx. I'm putting X's behind all of her 3 names. You know, he's butting up with her. They're on a tour right now, the anti-oligopoly tour. So I'm putting that in there, but he is right. And I showed this purposely to upset those people. Oh, it's Bernie Sanders. How could you do that? Get out of your categories. He was debating Hillary Clinton, right? By the way, when I see the files and current ones, recent ones that implicate Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton crime family, then I will start celebrating. Will it happen? I don't know. I'd like to see it. We need to see it. Yeah, is it necessary? No, we have all the receipts we need. We have all these, like I said, researchers, investigators, writers, journalists who have written the books on Bill and Hillary Clinton. I'm going to be devoting an entire talk to one who was killed several years ago. His name is Victor Thorn, Thorn. I was going to include him in this talk, but I realized I had too much material. So I'm going to go back later and pay homage to some of these people who brought us to the recent point of celebration that the intelligence agencies are releasing these files. It's because of the hard work, sacrifice of people like that. They are martyrs. And you can say, well, he's a conspiracy theorist because Professor Catherine Olmsted over at UC Davis puts him in that category. And there's a bunch of them. There's all kinds of books academic books that make fun of this type of work, but they're beginning to get nervous because they're realizing, because they're doing their own research, they're finding out that what was the conspiracy of yesteryear is the scholarly fact of today. So pat yourselves on the back. You were ahead of the curve. And there's penalties for being an early adopter. If you want to put it that way. There's penalties for being a little bit too fashion forward, right? Or whatever. You're just a little bit ahead of the other people, but they will catch up eventually if you just keep producing the material. And that's what's going on now. That's the good news. So your Catherine Olmstead's eventually she's going to age out. She's going to join the retirement ranks. She'll be an emeritus professor. She won't know what to do with her life because her whole career has been built upon just a lie. Like, by the way, in academia, you do not hire someone who started out as an undergraduate and a master's degree and a PhD. That doesn't happen. You do not grow your own. They send you off somewhere, and maybe they'll rehire you later on after you've proven yourself out in the larger academic world. But as a rule, they don't. So that's something is weird about that. Maybe one of you can do a research paper on it. I'll read it. You could trace her timeline. By the way, this type of intelligence, you might call it gossip, that I'm sharing with you here, it came in very handy in defending myself against the people who wanted me out of the university system. The same research skills that allowed me to figure out the hidden agenda that was going on in Southeast Asia and South Asia while it wasn't being publicized on the network news. Those same skills I could apply to the people who were sitting right in front of me trying to screw me over. I could find out who they were. I could look into their background. I could look up their papers. I could do a profile on them. And that includes the attorneys too. You don't think I didn't do that? No. So this research skills can save your career, let alone save your life. It's very practical. I don't do it just for amusement's sake. I'm a competitive son of a bitch, right? And I will use every competitive edge against you who try to fuck with me. That's just the way it's got to be. All right. You understand that? You could probably understand it when you're watching the NBA or Major League Sports or the World Series. I like it. I watch that too. But that's a game. That's a sport. I'm talking about reality here. Okay. And I'm telling you that because most people have a perception that the academic world is that of genteel discussion and disputation and dialogue. Well, I'm telling you, nothing could be further from the truth. You have some natural born killers occupying the halls of academe. You understand that? And that ranges from the people who are in the laboratory working on contracts for Dow Chemical to the president of the UC system who was brought in from the Department of Homeland Security, her name Janet Napolitano. What does that tell you? Okay, that's my world. You understand? Okay, now I want to leave us on a positive note, but at the same time, it's a critique of the current religious establishment because they are culpable for the moral degeneracy of the American public. I'm just focusing on American now, right? But it's probably true in Canada and Australia and most of Western Europe. The clergy, not just the Vatican, just the clergy. Moral degeneracy, because you don't hear them in this discussion. You don't hear a peep from them. But I will tell you, there was a time, and this was during the anti-war activity, during the war against American imperial aggression, otherwise known as the Vietnam War, where priests would put themselves on the line in acts of civil disobedience. Not the burning of Tesla, fake, paid for, Soros types, fake, dramatic violence. Not that. I'm talking about real, heartfelt, committed Christian and Jewish and Muslim in certain cases, and Buddhist acts of self-sacrifice to further the cause of peace. So let's remember that also. At the same time, we take glee over the latest revelation of some perverted priest who was playing with little children or girls or boys, right? We've had enough of those stories. There were people in the clergy who put them. Here's an example of that.
Broke into the Washington offices of Dow Chemical Company at 15th and L Streets Northwest yesterday, read the front page of the Washington Post on Sunday, March 23rd, 1969. But these were no ordinary burglars. Some rummaged through filing cabinets, shattering the fourth floor window and throwing the files out onto the street below. Others in the group poured vials of human blood onto furniture. Photographers, who had been notified in advance, captured the nearly 10 minutes of chaos until the DC police arrived and led the vandals out in handcuffs. The perpetrators, 4 priests, 2 seminarians, 1 nun, 1 ex-nun, and 1 young draft resistor. All were charged with felonies, carrying up to 25 years in prison. What could have turned these men and women of God from breaking bread to breaking and entering? The group would come to be known as the DC-9, although they came from across the country. They were united by a sense of anger over the Vietnam War.
To me, the loss of lives, Vietnamese lives and American lives in the war, was just so intolerable.
They also shared a sense that the church needed to be doing more.
And we had no statement from bishops at all on the war. And I really was extremely embarrassed for the church not being a leader.
They found a home in the Catholic Peace Movement, a loosely organized group of priests, nuns, and lay people who carried out acts of resistance against the Vietnam War. One such act was Catonsville 9, where activists broke into a draft office in Catonsville, Maryland, and burned draft cards with homemade napalm in 1968.
We make our prayer in the name of that God whose name is peace. And
I think that's Father Daniel Berrigan. I may be wrong. I don't know. I saw him, by the way, in Hiroshima. I went to visit the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And I went to Nagasaki a couple of days later, and Berrigan was there. Also, Daniel Ellsberg was there. Right? He's not a priest, but he was the Rand Corporation person there. Regardless of what you think about it, he was a peace activist after that. Where are these individuals now in the Ukraine-Russia war? They're nowhere to be found, because after the Catholic peace, it just dawned on me while I was watching this clip. After the Catholic peace movement, someone decided we need to make sure that this never happens again. So that's when the pedophiles were started to be recruited into the Catholic Church. And this is when the upper rungs of the administration and the Holy See was in all the way to the Vatican, as well as archdioceses all over the country and the world, started being stalked by all these corrupt people, like the Cardinal McCarrick. By the way, if you're on my X account, you'll see I have a posting there of Archbishop Vigano, who has an excellent book recently about his excommunication from the Church of Rome. Right. So you can see there's the historical progress from an activist Catholic Church that represented peace and humanity versus one that's steeped in, some would say, the dark arts. I will refer you to the book by Vigano himself, and he names these organizations, and he talks about immigrationism as one of the weapons there. Green, he uses the term green. Amazonian ritual, he didn't use the term, but I think he's referring to Pachamama worship, the pedophilia. It's a short book, but it's all the documents that the Vatican attorneys put together in order to have him excommunicated, and he's releasing it to us. This is a recent book. So the battle goes on. Okay, I promise to end after this. I want to again reaffirm the fact that the recent release of papers are neglecting a fundamental element of the whole Vietnam FBI, CIA, COINTEL system, right? COINTEL was as much about the anti-Vietnam War activity as it was against people who were representing civil rights movement, and whether they're Black Panthers or SLC, Southern Leadership, Christian Conference, all those people. It's about the war in Vietnam. Well, let's take a look, and this is from a film, documentary film. I think it was released in 1976. One of you fact checkers can nitpick me and correct me if I got the date wrong. You're going to miss the point, but you're going to get the date of release right. I think it's 1970. It's called Hearts and Minds. Right. Document, which won an Academy Award, by the way, for documentary. When was the last time that happened in Pacific Palisades, Hollywood / West LA? Hearts and Minds. And I used to show this to my students, hundreds of them in the intro course, who were the children of refugees from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. I said, this is American society. You have to look at it as a fact of life and find out, grapple with these realities. It's not going to be enough for you to come to the University of California, get a degree in bioscience so you can go to medical school and work for Big Pharma, or go to work for Dow Chemical, who would recruit every spring. They come to the campus and they want some yellow people to go work for Dow Chemical, and they will, because the money's good and there's benefits, security. And they don't have an understanding of the history. Maybe they're not even interested. But I, in my class, showed these clips, as horrible and as painful and as ugly as they are. Because history is painful, ugly, and horrible. Even it is glorious. Even as it is reflective of the triumphal spirit of these people who refuse to let go of the pursuit of truth. So here it is. Here's a clip from Hearts and Minds featuring General Westmoreland. And he's articulating in a candid, without any sort of reservations. He's having an LBJ moment. LBJ was being recorded, but he didn't know the whole public was on. He's on a documentary. Westmoreland knows he's being recorded for posterity, and he's totally unself-conscious about it. This is what General Westmoreland had to say about the yellow people. Yeah, that's your incendiary bombs ordinance. And the U.S. Air Force dropped more bombs on Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos than all the ordnance of the Allies in World War II. And all the social scientists in the bombing surveys were documenting it. And all the psychologists, the behavioral scientists, were figuring out their theories about trauma. And were they doing it so that they can avoid and avert such atrocities in the future? No, they're trying to figure out how they could use it against the American population in the future, which is now. Okay, so that's General Westmoreland. That's the clip I showed in my introductory courses. And that's also the clip that got me ratted out by a bunch of yellow students and probably the teaching assistant. That's why I'm always ranking on these doctoral students, right, who think they know a lot, but completely shattered their image of what they thought they knew. But anyway, I got ratted out, and that was really when the administration came down on me and gave me the message. if you keep going in this direction, it's not going to end well for you. And they send a guy in there. They took me in the room with no windows, and they asked me questions about it. And the guy had done his work. He's looked up Hearts and Minds, and he said, this film won an Academy Award? I said, yeah, of course. I said, he's a genuine filmmaker. Doug, I think forgot his name. His last name is Davis. I had a friend who worked on that film, by the way, who taught history at Yale. He cut part of the film. So, I'd done my work. I was doing, this is not something that was being made up. But that was the administration's way of telling me that I better not dwell on these unseemly topics, even though we're at the University of California, which is it's a Research 1 classification. There's less than 200 R1 universities in the United States of America out of it's more like 8,000, about 8,000 colleges, universities of different size. It's a large number. It's a very small are the R1. That's where I taught. Okay. And the oath that I took for myself is I'm going to pursue the truth wherever it may take me. So respectfully now, I told the guy, well, this is my work. You're welcome to sit in any class. I have nothing to hide. I'm not presenting anything and I didn't defend myself. I didn't make any excuses, but I was very professional and polite about it. So anyway, it took them years before they brought out Catherine Olmsted of the history department. This was just some low-level administrator who was put out there to put out fires. They have all these parasites that work in the university that are there to kind of do cleanup jobs. But you can tell you're making an impact when you're getting more talented people coming after you. Right. And eventually they sent out 5 attorneys from the headquarters in Oakland. Janet Napolitano, the president of the university herself, sent them out to get me. Right. So I promise you that I would kind of bring along my own personal as well as professional relationship to this topic. I've tried the best I can within the 90 minutes that I allotted myself. I'm sorry for going on, but I want to document this. I wanted to share this with you, and I'll see you back next week. And I'm going to be talking about some of these individuals that I could only allude to who paid the ultimate price with their lives in order for us to reach this moment where the public has demanded openness of its secret archives. And we're not through with that either. This is just the beginning. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Peace out.